The engineers at the Messerschmitt Design Bureau put a massive amount of effort into finally getting their troubled Me-210 aircraft up to an acceptable standard. But the airplane had already earned such a terrible reputation among pilots, so they decided to just change its name for all future developments. That led to the creation of the Me-410 Hornisse, which translates to Hornet. Since the basic design of the new Me-410 was not all that different from its failed predecessor, the factories were able to reuse a lot of the older parts and tooling. Incredibly, the engineers actually managed to iron out the main flaws of the Me-210. This happened just days before the entire program was about to be canceled. But Luftwaffe High Command was still desperate for a reliable heavy fighter, so the order came down: get the Me-410 design perfected as fast as possible. Despite the rush, the first actual production model of the updated aircraft did not roll out right away. It took 9 months after they had shut down the original Me-210 assembly lines. Externally and in its basic structure, the Me-410 looked a lot like its predecessor, but it still featured a number of major upgrades. The biggest changes were to the wings. They narrowed the chord slightly and reduced the leading edge sweep. They also fitted them with automatic Handley Page leading edge slats. This massively improved the overall handling. The doors for the various bays and hatches were now operated hydraulically instead of manually. The engineers also redesigned the radiator flaps. They improved the aileron design and lengthened the tail section of the fuselage slightly. But the most important upgrade was the heart of the aircraft. Instead of the old power plants, they fitted the fighter with more powerful DB603 engines. Each put out an impressive 1,750 horsepower. The very first prototype for the new fighter was actually based on an existing Me-210 airframe. This airframe was heavily modified. This updated aircraft took to the skies for the first time in the spring of 1944. To make sure they were on the right track, the designers also ran a series of comparative flight tests. They did this by converting several older airframes into the new Me-410 standard. However, to save time and resources, they left the older DB601 engines in those specific testbeds. As the Me-410 development program shifted into high gear, Messerschmitt continued utilizing older airframes. Eventually, though, the factory started rolling out aircraft built from the ground up specifically as Me-410s. Most of those early prototypes were used to test different weapon configurations and new equipment. In total, they built over 24 of these test aircraft, and the flight test results were highly impressive. Compared to its predecessor, the flight characteristics of the Me-410 were vastly improved. The biggest win was that the new aircraft no longer snapped into an uncontrollable spin. This had been an absolute nightmare for the pilots. Furthermore, the new model proved to be far more capable than the veteran Bf-110. This was the very aircraft it was supposed to replace in frontline service. Once the first prototype successfully completed its flight testing, the Augsburg plant started gearing up for full-scale production. High Command planned to produce the aircraft in 2 main variants. First was a high-speed bomber, designated in German as the Schnellbomber. Second was a heavy fighter, known in the Luftwaffe as a Zerstörer. In January, the Luftwaffe officially accepted its first batch of 5 of these new aircraft into service. Both variants of the aircraft were very similar. They shared the exact same baseline armament. Mounted directly in the nose were 2 powerful 20mm MG-151 cannons. They also had 2 7.92mm machine guns. Additionally, to defend against rear attacks, the aircraft featured 2 13mm machine guns. These were housed in specialized, remotely controlled side barbettes. As for the bomb load, both versions could carry up to 2,200 pounds of ordnance in the internal bomb bay. This could consist of a single massive 1,000-kilogram bomb. Alternatively, it could hold 2 500-kilogram bombs or 8 smaller 50-kilogram bombs, though it is worth noting that any overall payload over 1,100 pounds was considered a severe overload for the airframe. The variants specifically adapted as dive bombers also received precision bomb sights. They included external racks for 4 extra 50-kilogram bombs. At the personal request of Hermann Göring, factories made production of the high-speed bomber their absolute top priority. Over time, they started building more highly specialized variants based on this airframe. For instance, a reconnaissance variant was introduced. It was equipped with powerful aerial cameras. There was also a dedicated heavy fighter featuring an external gun pod. This pod was mounted directly over the bomb bay doors. It housed 2 additional 20mm cannons with a reserve of 250 rounds per gun. Thanks to a streamlined production process, by the end of April 1943, the Luftwaffe had already taken delivery of 48 brand new Me-410s. By the end of 1943, the plant in Augsburg had built 457 Me-410A models. In December of that same year, production also began at the Dornier facility in Oberpfaffenhofen. By February 1944, this plant successfully hit its maximum projected output. By that time, engineers had also managed to upgrade a large number of older Me-210 airframes. This brought them up to the much-improved Me-410 standard. German High Command decided to arm a portion of these aircraft with the devastating 50mm Bk-5 cannon. At the time, this weapon was considered arguably the most effective tool for taking down Allied heavy bombers. The cannon was first tested back in early August 1943. At that time, it was mounted on one of the experimental Me-210A airframes. Eventually, this exact aircraft was converted to the newer Me-410 standard. In this upgraded state, it was sent to a special proving ground in Tarnowitz. There, it underwent an extensive series of test firings. Those trials proved to be a complete success. However, at the time, only a handful of aircraft actually received this devastating weapon. All of these unique aircraft were grouped together into a separate test squadron. The goal was to prove the large caliber cannon's real-world effectiveness directly in harsh combat conditions. One interesting detail is about the very first test Me-410. It kept its standard baseline armament alongside that massive 50mm cannon. Meanwhile, the aircraft sent for frontline trials carried absolutely nothing but this single gun. It was paired with a specialized optical sight. The frontline combat testing once again exceeded expectations. Because of this, Luftwaffe Command decided to equip another 100 aircraft with the Bk-5 cannons. This new batch of Me-410s was not quite as stripped down. They managed to retain their full standard armament suite. These aircraft were handed over to a reorganized fighter wing. The pilots of this wing had previously flown the older Me-210s. At the same time, engineers ran into another issue. The standard airframe was notoriously difficult to adapt for aerial reconnaissance missions. Because of this, designers developed a separate dedicated recon variant of the Me-410A. On this variant, all the bulky camera gear was cleverly packed into the nose section. However, they had to completely remove the forward-firing armament to make it fit. In April 1944, updated Me-410s began rolling off the assembly line. They were equipped with significantly more powerful DB603S engines featuring a higher compression ratio. Thanks to this upgrade, pilots could use emergency boost. This allowed them to squeeze out an impressive 1,900 horsepower at 2,700 RPM. Later variants, like the Me-410B, were designed as multi-role aircraft. They were capable of operating as both high-speed bombers and heavy fighters. Some of these variants were equipped with special gun pods. These pods housed 2 20mm MG-151 cannons. On other versions, designers went even further. They replaced the standard armament with 2 powerful 30mm Mk-103 cannons. As a nasty surprise for enemy bombers, they kept that same massive 50mm Bk-5 cannon. To make sure all this firepower was as accurate as possible, the fighters were fitted with upgraded gun sights and new DB603G engines. To make the aircraft even more versatile, the German aviation industry produced interchangeable field modification kits known as Rüstsätze. These allowed ground crews to quickly expand the combat capabilities of standard production aircraft right at frontline airbases. However, this made the designation of these field modifications a nightmare for Luftwaffe record-keeping. Overall, the Me-410 family became a real testbed for constant experiments with weapons. These weapons were designed to effectively shoot down enemy heavy bombers. For instance, in April 1944, instead of the huge 50mm cannon, they tried installing a slightly smaller weapon on some airframes. This was the 37mm Bk-3.7. A few aircraft with this specific loadout even managed to go through rigorous testing in actual combat units on the front lines. To make the aircraft even more deadly, launchers for massive 21-centimeter Wurfgranate 21 rockets were installed on some airframes. These were placed right under the center wing section. They even attached an experimental 6-tube launcher for these rockets onto one Me-410A1. But during the initial tests, it turned out that firing all 6 rockets at once caused serious structural damage to the aircraft. Despite this, the engineers did not give up and kept pushing forward with the idea. Through numerous attempts and experiments, they finally managed to tweak the system. Eventually, firing a full salvo was finally deemed safe for both the pilot and the airframe. In May 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command issued a strict order. They wanted to convert all existing standard Me-410s to serve exclusively as heavy fighters. In practice, however, they only managed to convert a small portion of the fleet. Many squadrons continued using their Me-410s as conventional bombers. What is more, by the end of the summer, some combat wings began gradually replacing these aircraft with the brand new Me-262 jets. There was even a brief period in the spring of 1944 when they tried using the Me-410 as a night fighter. But this experiment never really caught on. The vast majority of these aircraft flew missions with heavy fighter and aerial reconnaissance units. As for the dedicated reconnaissance variant, the Me-410B3, its only real difference from the previous model was the use of new and more powerful engines. A few Luftwaffe units based in occupied France received the Me-410B6 variant. However, by the summer of 1944, intense Allied pressure forced these squadrons to quickly pull back from French airfields. They were transferred to defend the skies over Germany itself, joining the defense of the Reich. One interesting detail about the Me-410B6 is that it was equipped with the FUG-200 Hohenweiler maritime patrol radar. Its older MG-17 machine guns were replaced with more powerful MG-131s. Standard Waffenbehälter 103 underwing gun pods provided additional firepower. Despite some initial success in combat, the number of operational Me-410s started dropping fast. Their biggest issue was a lack of maneuverability. In a dogfight, these heavy twin-engine fighters simply could not escape the much more agile American P-51 Mustangs. And when the German High Command launched the Jägernaut program in September 1944. This was an emergency fighter program that shifted production away from twin-engine aircraft in favor of single-engine fighters. As a result, Me-410 production was shut down permanently. Overall, during that final year of production, 702 Me-410s rolled off the assembly lines. Over 250 of them were built at Dornier factories. Over the aircraft's entire production run, the German aviation industry built 1,160 examples. And that is not even counting the airframes that were hastily converted from the older Me-210. Interestingly, even before mass production wrapped up, engineers managed to build a few highly unusual prototypes for the B-series. Here are a couple of the standouts. First is the dedicated torpedo bomber, the Me-410B5. This aircraft carried the FUG-200 Hohenweiler maritime radar. Its forward armament was stripped down to the bare minimum. This left just 2 MG-151-20E autocannons, but its real offensive punch lay elsewhere. The bomber could carry the devastating BT-series bomb torpedoes. To help the aircraft patrol vast stretches of ocean for as long as possible, the designers did something clever. By removing the remote-controlled rear MG-131 machine guns, they freed up space to install extra fuel tanks. Another tank could be mounted directly inside the bomb bay. This tank held 650 liters, or about 172 gallons of fuel. Because of this setup, all offensive ordnance had to be carried externally on underwing hardpoints. Under its wings, this maritime hunter could carry 2 heavy BT-400 bomb torpedoes, or 4 lighter BT-200s. If the mission called for a different approach, a massive SC-1800 general-purpose bomb could be slung underneath instead of the torpedoes. However, that meant ground crews had to remove the internal bomb bay fuel tank. There were other loadout options too. For instance, it could carry a single massive LT-56 torpedo weighing nearly 2,000 pounds. Alternatively, it could carry the slightly lighter LT-5, which weighed in at around 1,760 pounds. On top of that, the arsenal of the Me-410B5 included a truly unique weapon. This was a bouncing bomb called the SB-800RS Kurt, also known as the roll bomb. It was designed to skip across the surface of the water to accurately take out dams, dikes, and other heavy water infrastructure. A special SB-1410 parachute bomb was also available as an alternative. They even considered what was a pretty sci-fi idea for the time. This involved arming these aircraft with L-10 Friedensangle gliding torpedoes, which could glide to the target autonomously after being dropped. Another interesting prototype was the Me-410 B-6 heavy fighter. Its main feature was a serious boost in firepower. The older 7.92mm forward-firing machine guns were swapped out for much more powerful 13mm MG-131 heavy machine guns. Inside the bomb bay, the designers left enough room to mount two devastating 30mm Mk-103 aircraft cannons. Just like the torpedo bomber, this fighter could carry the FUG-200 Hohentuil maritime search radar to hunt down enemy ships. On paper, there were also projects for long-range reconnaissance. These included a daytime version known as the Me-410B7 and a nighttime version, the Me-410B8. The night variant was especially unusual. Instead of carrying a standard bomb load, its bays concealed powerful searchlights to illuminate targets in the dark. Despite these innovations, both reconnaissance models kept their standard set of defensive guns. However, by the end of the war, engineers managed to build only a single prototype from this recon series. Even before the Me-410 aircraft project was officially canceled, Messerschmitt teamed up with the Design Bureau to launch a massive modernization program. The main goal came down to two things: making the aircraft even more powerful and drastically expanding its combat capabilities. The new variant, designated the Me-410C, was slated to get an extended center wing section and updated outer panels. Thanks to this, the wingspan was planned to increase to 59 or even 67 feet, which was expected to positively impact handling. Engineers also heavily redesigned the cockpit's aerodynamics to reduce drag. To power the aircraft, they proposed using the powerful DB603 JZ series engines, though they left the option of installing alternative power plants like the Jumo 213 FJZ or the BMW 801 TJ. The program itself was incredibly ambitious and envisioned creating several highly specialized variants right out of the gate, from a heavy fighter and ground attack aircraft to a torpedo bomber and even a night fighter. For night operations, the aircraft was to be equipped with the advanced Liechtenstein SN2 series radar. And while a fully completed prototype of the Me-410C was never actually built, a lot of its innovative features were successfully carried over to the earlier Me-410A series. Among the most noticeable improvements were turbocharged engines and efficient annular radiators. In the spring of 1944, all work on the C lineup had to be shut down. Instead, developers shifted their focus to the new D series. Its main feature was supposed to be a wooden airframe. Germany desperately needed to conserve strategic materials like aluminum. However, designing a reliable wooden combat aircraft proved difficult, so the completion of this project was pushed back by at least a year. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe High Command demanded that designers create an aircraft capable of flying at much higher altitudes. To meet these demands, development of a new high-altitude variant, the Me-410H, began based on the Me-410B model. This aircraft was equipped with modified DB603G engines. The wings took on a rectangular shape, their span reaching an impressive 75 feet, with a total area of over 500 square feet. The armament on this aircraft was truly lethal. Two 20mm MG-151 20 cannons and four 30mm Mk-108 and Mk-103 cannons turned it into a heavy-hitting gunship. On top of this massive arsenal, the aircraft could carry over 2,400 pounds of bombs. The empty weight of the fighter stood at over 26,450 pounds, while fully loaded it tipped the scales at nearly 29,540 pounds. Thanks to clean aerodynamics and powerful engines, this heavy fighter could accelerate to 328 miles per hour at sea level. After climbing to an altitude of over 21,300 feet, its top speed increased to nearly 390 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe High Command had high hopes for this design, and even planned to mass convert older airframes into the new H model. But the harsh realities of war dictated otherwise. The program was canceled before engineers could even finish drafting the necessary blueprints. During its production run, a total of 1,160 Me-410s rolled off the assembly lines. The bulk of them, 902 aircraft, were built at the main Messerschmitt factories, while another 258 were assembled at Dornier facilities. The first 5 advanced Me-410s joined the ranks of the Luftwaffe in early 1943. By spring, the Frontline units had received nearly 50 more. The re-equipment process was picking up steam. In combat squadrons, particularly in the famous Wespen or Wasp group, the flawed Me-210As were actively being swapped out for fresh Me-410As. One of the first units to receive the aircraft in its heavy fighter configuration was a special test detachment led by Hauptmann Eduard Tratt. Based at the Wittmundhafen airfield, this elite unit focused on testing the heaviest airborne weaponry in real tactical conditions. This included experimental large-caliber cannons and air-to-air rockets. In the fall of 1943, Eduard Tratt was promoted to command a heavy fighter group in the Horst Vessel Wing. His pilot's primary mission was the defense of the Reich against devastating Allied daylight bombing raids. Initially based in southern Germany, they later relocated to Königsberg. Tratt was killed in late February 1944. This happened during a fierce dogfight with American heavy bombers in the skies over Nordhausen. By the time of his final mission, the outstanding ace had racked up 39 confirmed aerial victories. In April 1943, one of the Luftwaffe bomber squadrons began a massive re-equipping process. They replaced their older Do-217s with new Me-410s. By the end of May, the 2nd Bomber Wing had almost 40 brand new Me-410s and fewer than 20 of the older Do-217s at their disposal. However, by June, the decision was made to transfer these new aircraft to the newly formed 5th Bomber Group. The unit's main task was testing the Me-410 in real combat conditions. Here, it was expected to act as a fast bomber. The group took an active part in offensive operations. These were under the direction of the Special Command Angriffsführer England. To form it, the Luftwaffe combined forces from several different bomber units, specifically from the 2nd, 40th, and likely the 101st Wings. In early 1944, the unit was reorganized and folded into the 51st Bomber Wing. They joined forces with the Edelweiss Wing, which by that time had already swapped out its old Ju-88s for modern Me-410s. Together, they launched a series of daring raids on Great Britain. This air campaign became known in history as the Baby Blitz. The Beauvais airfield in France served as the home base for these bombers. Alongside them in early 1944, there were also reconnaissance units stationed on French soil flying the Me-410. Among them was the 121st Squadron. They were initially based at the famous Orly airfield in Paris before moving to Toussaint-le-Noble. It reported to Long-Range Reconnaissance Group 1, or Fernaufklärungsgruppe 1. This same reconnaissance formation also included a squadron out of Warsaw and another unit based far to the north in Riga. The operational footprint of these aircraft was constantly expanding. In May 1943, brand new Me-410s joined the ranks of the 1st Heavy Fighter Wing. At the time, this wing was fighting in the sweltering skies of Tunisia. A short time later, the 122nd Reconnaissance Squadron took delivery of the same aircraft. This unit was stationed on the island of Sardinia. Interestingly, this reconnaissance unit also kept flying the Ju-88. This was an airframe their pilots were already intimately familiar with. On April 2nd, around 15 Me-410s went on a dedicated hunt for American bombers. These targets belonged to the 2nd Air Division of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The German crews chased the enemy all the way back to Great Britain. Just as the American bombers were touching down at their home bases, the Germans launched a devastating surprise attack on the airfields. During this daring raid, the Luftwaffe lost only a single crew. The pilot, Oberleutnant Klaus Krüger, and his radio operator, Feldwebel Reichhardt, were killed in action. In the process, however, the German crews managed to destroy a significant number of American aircraft on the ground. Production was steadily ramping up. By the end of 1943, the Augsburg plant alone had managed to roll out 457 Me-410s. In December of that same year, the Luftwaffe started receiving the first airframes assembled at the Dornier facilities. By January 1944, the Air Force had taken delivery of 11 more brand-new aircraft from the manufacturer. But combat took its toll, and losses were inevitable. The 5th Group lost its first aircraft on the night of July 14th into the 15th. This happened in the skies over the British county of Essex, near Felixstowe. A German Me-410, flown by the pilot Feldwebel Zwissler and his gunner Oberfeldwebel Reed, was shot down. This kill was credited to Flight Lieutenant Bunting of No. 85 Squadron RAF. He was flying a Mosquito night fighter. Soon after, British Mosquitoes took an even heavier toll. A second Me-410 from that same German group was intercepted and destroyed. This was done by pilots of No. 85 Squadron near Dunkirk, France. A third German aircraft fell victim to a Mosquito crew from No. 256 Squadron near Beachy Head. The situation in the air was steadily turning against Germany. At the start of 1943, a relatively small number of aircraft took part in Allied raids on German strategic targets. By the summer, however, the intensity of the bombing campaigns had skyrocketed. They gained momentum with each passing day. This forced the German High Command to look for new solutions. To protect their own skies and defend the Reich, they urgently needed a massive influx of fighters. To fill this gap, aircraft were diverted straight off the assembly lines. Active squadrons were also recalled from other sectors of the front. Under these conditions, twin-engine heavy fighters proved incredibly effective. They were perfectly suited for grueling, extended engagements against the massive American four-engine bombers. This was because they were capable of carrying significantly heavier armament. In September 1943, a German fighter wing known as Horst Wessel began a major re-equipment process. Their obsolete Me-210 aircraft were being phased out in favor of the newer and much more powerful Me-410s. Armed with this new hardware, the group joined other units. Together, they formed a formidable defense against the American 8th Air Force. On March 16, 1944, a combined force of German Bf-110 and Me-410 heavy fighters launched a massive ambush. They attacked a huge formation of American bombers. This included around 500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and a staggering 2,000 B-24 Liberators. This massive bomber stream was heading out to strike aircraft factories in southern Germany. The German fighters unleashed a barrage of cannon fire and air-to-air rockets. They shot down 18 American aircraft. These heavy U.S. losses were the result of a brutal but effective tactic. The Germans struck at the exact moment the American fighter escorts had to turn back to base after reaching the limit of their range. In April, the U.S. 8th Air Force pressed the offensive. They kept up their massive daylight raids. On April 10th, 900 B-17 and B-24 bombers took to the skies. They were heading out to strike 6 major targets in eastern Germany. This time, they had a heavy fighter escort flying with them. This escort consisted of 6 groups of P-51 Mustangs and 4 groups of P-38 Lightnings. However, between the cities of Poznan and Rostock, a formation of American bombers was hit hard. They were attacked by German Ju-88s and Me-410s armed with heavy rockets. The Americans lost 25 aircraft. Another section of bombers was flying without any fighter escort. They were intercepted over Stettin, where they again suffered heavy losses. Overall, during those few brutal days, the U.S. 8th Air Force suffered severe casualties. They lost 52 B-17s, 12 B-24s, and 16 fighters. Looking back at the summer of 1943, factory-fresh Me-410s, armed with powerful BK-5 cannons, began entering service in large numbers. They joined newly formed German squadrons. These units quickly became a core part of the Third Reich's air defense network. They inflicted serious damage, shooting down scores of American bombers. However, on May 13, 1944, while trying to intercept another American bomber stream near Poznan, the German heavy fighters were drawn into a fierce dogfight. They faced highly maneuverable American P-51s. The Germans took such catastrophic losses that their air group was rendered completely combat ineffective. Eventually, the remnants of this unit had to be entirely re-equipped with a different fighter, specifically the single-engine FW-190. The air war raged on. On July 7th, a group of Me-410s alongside FW-190s pounced on a formation of B-24 Liberators. The bombers were heading out to target aircraft plants and synthetic oil refineries. 7 German Me-410s boldly engaged 2 groups of American P-38s. During this aggressive clash, one P-38 was piloted by Captain James Morris. He was an experienced pilot who already had 7 aerial victories to his credit. His aircraft was caught in the devastating fire of the German fighters' 13mm machine guns and shot down. But when another fighter squadron arrived to reinforce the Americans, the situation in the air drastically reversed. In just a few minutes, the Americans shot down 3 and seriously damaged 4 German Me-410s. By that time, the last major synthetic fuel plants supplying the German war machine were tucked away in Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. These became priority targets for the U.S. 15th Air Force based in Italy. On June 16, 1944, the 37th Bomb Group launched a massive raid. They targeted the Nova plant near Vienna and the Apollo plant in the Hungarian city of Pozsony. Just as the Americans began their bomb run, they were swarmed. A formation of about 40 German single and twin engine fighters, including Me-410s, attacked them. A brutal dogfight ensued, costing the Germans several aircraft. One Me-410 went down roughly 4 miles from the Hungarian settlement of Gonyú. The crash killed its crew instantly. Another Me-410 bore the nickname Hornisse, which is German for hornet. This aircraft crashed about 11 miles east of the city of Győr. Later that month, on June 26th, Allied bombers targeted 5 oil refineries in the Vienna area. Over the Austrian town of Moosbierbaum, a formation of 36 B-24 Liberators was suddenly bounced by 20 German twin-engine fighters. Meanwhile, German single-engine aircraft engaged the American fighter escort, drawing them away. The German Me-410s hammered the heavy B-24s with cannon and rocket fire. But the American gunners held their nerve, laying down a heavy wall of defensive crossfire. They managed to shoot down several Me-410s. One went down near the Hungarian town of Alsó-Kemeniz. This killed the pilot, Straube, and the radio operator gunner, Schroer. Another German fighter crashed near Kuti in Moravia. Its crew, pilot Corporal Evers and radio operator gunner Corporal Schauenberg, were also killed. Another loss for the Luftwaffe occurred northeast of Prague. Here, pilot Bessemueller and radio operator gunner Wassermann went down with their Me-410. 2 weeks later, on July 8th, the 55th Bomb Wing delivered a massive strike against the oil refinery in Floridsdorf. Just 25 minutes after the attack, a massive formation of American aircraft was intercepted by 60 German fighters. In this fierce aerial battle, the 464th Bomb Group lost 3 bombers, and the 465th Bomb Group lost 1. In return, the German squadrons lost 8 of their twin-engine Me-410s. By the second half of July 1944, it was abundantly clear. The twin-engine Me-410s were no longer capable of carrying out their assigned combat missions. The reason was obvious. Allied fighters were firmly establishing total air superiority. The German heavy fighters simply could not go toe-to-toe with the far more agile American single-engine fighters. As a result, the Luftwaffe High Command shifted its main focus to light, single-engine aircraft. On top of that, the Germans were facing a critical shortage of spare parts. Under these conditions, the heavy Me-410s were withdrawn from frontline combat units en masse. By September 1944, German industry had produced 702 of these aircraft. After that, production was halted entirely. By the end of the year, the aircraft remained in service with just 1 air group based in Norway. There, they were used exclusively for reconnaissance flights. Meanwhile, other heavy fighter units transitioned to more survivable single-engine fighters. The fate of these captured aircraft turned out to be quite interesting. The British military managed to capture an Me-410A reconnaissance variant in fully working condition down in Italy. To carry out comprehensive flight tests, the aircraft was given a new serial number, TF209. Today, you can actually see another surviving example of this model over at the RAF Museum Cosford. The American military also managed to get their hands on a combat-ready Me-410A. Today, this historic aircraft is kept in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. However, it is currently in storage. It is partially disassembled and not on display to the general public. Another aircraft fell into Soviet hands. This was an Me-410B variant armed with the powerful Bk-5 cannon. It underwent rigorous testing at an airfield near Moscow in the city of Ramenskoye. In addition, back in 1944, one Me-410 was sent to Japan. This was part of a technology transfer program. This particular airframe was an interesting case. It had been converted from the earlier Me-210 model by installing the more reliable DB601F engines. Over in the Soviet Union during the war, engineers from the Soviet Air Force State Scientific Research Institute test flew a whole lineup of captured German aircraft. The Me-410 went by the nickname Hornisse, or Hornet, in the Luftwaffe. It was no exception. Soviet pilots flew it at the very tail end of the Second World War. The main focus of their research was a heavy fighter variant captured at an enemy airfield. In their documents, it was listed as an Me-410B. It was equipped with the large 50mm Bk-5 cannon. To avoid any confusion, let us clarify the variants of this aircraft right from the start. The primary difference between the base Me-410A and Me-410B versions came down to the engines. The first version was fitted with the DB603A engine. The second version got the significantly more powerful DB603G. However, the Soviet report clearly stated that their captured aircraft was equipped with DB603A engines, and that means the engineers were actually evaluating an Me-410A variant. Now let us take a closer look at the armament. The standard version of this Messerschmitt featured the 50mm Bk-5 cannon. It also featured a formidable secondary forward-firing battery. This included two 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns. But the captured aircraft studied by the Soviet specialists differed a bit from the standard configuration. In its nose section, in addition to the large main cannon, it only had two 20mm MG-151 cannons. It also had a single 13mm MG-131 machine gun. More than likely, German mechanics were modifying the weapon's loadout themselves in the field. They were stripping away the extra armament to save weight. They were trying to extract every last ounce of performance for air-to-air combat.